First of all, thank you everybody for joining this webinar. We had 250 registrations, which was a lot more than we imagined. We thought this was going to, CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, was going to stay some niche topic that only those deep in the woods and the weeds would care about, but clearly that is changing. So this is a webinar that's hosted by Sophia, Martin, and myself from WWF, Fern, and Carbon Market Watch. And this is our agenda. If I could switch slides, yes. We'll go first through a bit of the introduction on the concepts around this. CRCF is still a niche technical topic, and it's important that we kind of understand how it works and what it is. Then Martin will go a bit deeper into biomass sustainability of the so-called delegated acts, the methodology that we'll be looking at today. That's the methodology for permanent removals under the CRCF. Martin and myself were members of the Commission's expert group on this. We've been following this since day one. And then Sophia will go a bit more into the legal concerns, looking a bit at how the CRCF regulation, what stipulations are in there in the basic legal act, and how this delegated act doesn't really respect quite a few of those. And finally, we're very happy that Felix from Oiko Institute will join us. He'll react a bit to what we're saying, what he agrees with, maybe also some things he doesn't agree with, and uses extensive knowledge and that of his colleagues on other carbon crediting standards, so looking a bit into how they compare. Just for transparency's sake, Felix has also been, Felix and his colleagues have also been hired by Carbon Market Watch in the past to look at the CRCF itself, at its delegated acts. So he'll also be building on that work, that analytical work that he's done. So I'll get started with the introduction now. So there are a few things that I want to look at. I want to look at a bit of what are permanent removals, how do you define this, what is the CRCF, the Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Framework, and lastly, why should we care about it? Because I do think it's kind of flying under the radar and it's time to highlight it a bit more. So what are permanent removals? Tanze and Ramirez, two academics from the Technical University of Delft, wrote in 2019 a very good paper highlighting 4 basic principles that need to be respected for something to be deemed a permanent carbon removal. The first is your carbon does actually come from the atmosphere. Second is you store it out of the atmosphere, hopefully permanent. Third, you look at your associated emissions in your process. So where are sources of emissions within your removal process? And fourth, if you sum up all those associated emissions, that should be smaller than the carbon that you're removing. These are all very, very logical things, but there are actually issues in this delegated act, the Permanent Carbon Removal Delegated Act. There are issues across the board on all 4 of these. For example, on the first one, on physical removal from the atmosphere, we're actually seeing that the Commission is also using removal from the biosphere as a way of quantifying removals. And the question is, does the biosphere always remove from the atmosphere or not? That's kind of ignored here. When it comes to permanent storage, if you want to store something permanent, you also have to keep an eye on it, MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, and you need liability if there's a leak. And what we're seeing here is that for at least one of the technologies in this delegated act, biochar, that element is missing. Third, and what for me at least is the biggest problem, is these associated emissions. The delegated act ignores large sources. We'll go deeper into those. On biomass, we have direct and indirect land use change, which are kind of ignored. On energy, there's this grandfathering of rules for renewable energy certificates till 2045. They can use so-called annual matching instead of hourly matching, meaning looser rules than actually the green hydrogen producers. They have far stronger rules for green hydrogen than for energy used in electricity used in these technologies. We do have to say this. Unfortunately, we do need removals. We're going to have to use them. The scientific consensus on this is getting stronger and stronger. That if we want to reach carbon neutrality, if we want to reach net zero, address the climate crisis, we are going to need some removals, but they do have to be sustainable. And so we are not necessarily against the concept of removals, but we'd like them to be done well. We'd like them to not damage ecosystems, to not have social consequences that are unacceptable, etc. And that's why we've been following these delegated actions methodologies. that brings me to what is the CRCF? You're going to see a lot of colorful figures here. I'm hoping to brighten up people's days, brighten up everybody's day a bit. There's some colorful figures on the CRCF. First and foremost, in a nutshell, the CRCF is a accounting and certification scheme. That is not a simple matter. Accounting for these things, nobody says it's easy. It is not easy. It is extremely complex. And there are many political pressures, however, that keep this from becoming a fully scientific or science-based exercise. There's a lot of political pressure on the system, which makes it a bit of a balancing act between, on the one hand, what we would call, or what I would call, environmental rigor. The CRCF regulation itself, the base legal act, talks about conservative, accurate, complete quantification based on latest available science. These are kind of principles that are in there that are very important. But on the other hand, we are in a period of simplification. There's a strong political dogma on easy to use, low on red tape, simple for investors or business, etc. And in our assessment, this balance is really missing. The simplification dogma is clearly outweighing the environmental rigor part of the scheme. So that's in a nutshell. I'll go a little bit deeper, or a slightly bigger nutshell, maybe a coconut shell. So the CRCF uses the so-called quality criteria. There's 4 of them: quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. And together, these make the absolutely horrendous acronym quality. I won't go deeper into them, but it's important because these 4 things will actually raise issues with all 4 of them in the rest of this presentation. And it uses those to certify removals or emission reductions in 3 big baskets of technologies or activities: carbon farming, that's anything with the land sector; carbon storage and products, that's more about buildings at the moment, so wooden beams and buildings; and then permanent removals. And our focus today is very much on that permanent removal side. In this delegated act that we're looking at, well, permanent removals, there's a wide host of technologies. This Permanent Removal Act at the moment looks only at bio-CCS, that's carbon capture and storage of biogenic CO2, direct air capture, so that's directly from the atmosphere, and biochar. And there are others that are in process of being looked at at very early stages, but they are not part of this delegated act. Well, why should we care about all this? Because, and there's a lot of text here, because it impacts a lot of elements of the EU policy framework in the climate and energy side, but also in wider environmental policy. Carbon farming could impact the LULUCF regulation, the effort sharing regulation, the common agricultural policy, etc., etc., etc. Carbon storage in buildings has a whole host of things that it could be related to. But today we're focused on permanent removals. And there it's clear that they might play a role in the ETS, the emission trading system, but they already play a role in the Innovation Fund, in state aid at national level, in the Life and Horizon projects, but also in the EU Biomass Club that's currently under discussion. And all these 3 big boxes together will have an impact on the 2040 net 90 target, on the climate neutrality target, also on national targets, the taxonomy, bioeconomy strategy, etc., etc., etc. So while CRCF is a bit of a technical accounting niche, it has implications across the board for policies that people might not be aware. People who are working on these policies might not be aware that at some point CRCF will impact the certification or the accounting of activities in those projects. So when we look a bit deeper at permanent removals, as I already mentioned, it will impact potentially the ETS. The Commission is currently looking at it and will in the summer propose a revision of the ETS. And one of the elements they have to look at is potential inclusion of permanent removals there, focusing on direct air capture and bio-CCS. So that's very early. That's in 5 months' time. We might have something on that. There's one important thing there, and that is the Commission has to propose something that does not undermine necessary emission reductions. And through that interaction with ETS, permanent removals will interact with the 2040 target, 2050 targets. And in general, we worry that this will be a case of offsetting or compensating or balancing, whatever word we want to use for it. But especially in ETS, I think there's a very large risk of offsetting, that we will be equating these permanent removals with fossil fuel emissions in the sectors that are covered by ETS one-on-one. And that makes it very important that we are quantifying these removals very well, because if we're going to be equating them with a fossil fuel emission, we have to be sure that they are, from a climate perspective, from an environmental perspective, they are worth the same. I'll stop here. We'll go to Martin now. I see there's already a hand raised. Maybe I should have started by saying, please use the Q&A. Sorry, I should have started with some housekeeping rules. Please use the Q&A. I see there's also something in the chat. But if you have a question for us or you want to add some of the discussion, please use the Q&A and then we'll look at that after our presentations. Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Wijnand. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I will share a few slides that I have prepared. With two simple observations. First, the title of my presentation, which is that removing carbon from forests at the expense of the land sink is not a permanent removal from the atmosphere. This talks to the points that Wijnand just mentioned. The second observation is that the laws of physics really don't give a damn about conservative politicians. But these are having a big impact in the rules that we are discussing today. And this was, in much more polite ways, of course, what was the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change just said 2 days ago, urging the EU to act quickly and swiftly and decisively on climate change. I've been a bioenergy campaigner with Fern for a long time, so this is a topic that I've been following for a long time as well. This is the situation we are inheriting. These are the emissions from the combustion of biomass. In the EU since 1990, the two red bars are when policy incentives were introduced to encourage the burning of wood in particular, but more biomass more broadly, for the sake of renewable energy policy. But renewable does not necessarily mean climate friendly. Today, as we speak, this is the share of biomass emissions in total ETS emissions. In policy, these are counted as zero because they're meant to be counted in the LULUCF sector. But as you can see, this is not marginal at all. I mean, we are talking about emissions that are roughly comparable with those of the German economy at the moment. You will hear a lot that bioenergy is just made out of residues. This is not true, and this is the proof. You can see that the share of wood used for the proportion of energy is actually increasing over time as opposed to the material uses, which makes much more sense from a climate perspective. This is having consequences. The land sink is getting undermined, and the overall observation you can make is that the EU's renewable energy policy, and in particular sustainability criteria for biomass, are directly undermining the EU's climate action. And that is the reason why the same organization I mentioned at the beginning, the Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, which is an official EU body, said last February 25, very explicitly that red criteria should really not used for qualifying wood used for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, which plays a big, big role in climate modeling. The reason is simple. The red criteria are the outcome of a bad political compromise. They're certainly not science. But unfortunately, in the delegated act that we are discussing today, DG Klima just did that. I will spare you all the wording, but essentially all the checkpoints of the data of the red are here: the sustainability criteria, the greenhouse gas savings criteria, the very, very, very lax reporting requirements, and the compliance route for certification, which consist through voluntary schemes recognized by the Commission. I'll get back to this later. They did 2 attempts at damage control beyond the red, while staying compliant with that. One for bio-CCS, which is a slightly broader category than BECCS. BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, so that essentially looks at combustion. It's very hypothetical. I mean, it doesn't exist yet. What exists is the capture of CO2 fluxes from fermentation. And that's why they broadened the wording to bio-CCS. It is very, very small. So they introduced an economic test to avoid that new bioenergy plants are being built primarily for the purpose of generating carbon credits or over-consuming biomass for the same purpose. But non-energy applications are not covered, so that's a big gap. That's for bio-CCS. Another attempt at mitigating the damages. I mean, I'm going fast, but this is 2 years of discussion with them. So they know that this is risky and that they shouldn't have done that. For biochar, they have restricted the eligible feedstocks to waste and residues, but those are defined by the red. And this, coming from the bioenergy perspective again, this is in the red what a residue looks like. Whole trees who essentially don't have a higher market value as something else than bioenergy. Burning these trees is subsidized. Before that, they were happily removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Turning these trees into biochar will not remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I'll get back to this later. And capturing some emissions from their combustion in the BECCS installation would not be a removal from the atmosphere either. But importantly, it would enable continued red subsidies. And this is why the bioenergy industry is very interested in BECCS. Even though, again, BECCS doesn't exist yet because it's very costly and technically it doesn't quite work yet. Biochar really deserves a special mention. In the Delegated Act, it is considered a permanent form of carbon removal, like DAGs and bio-CCS, but in the real world, that's not the case. When it is applied to soil, which is the main use case for sin, it undergoes various forms of erosion. Initially, interestingly, in the expert group discussion, it was not considered a permanent form of carbon removal. It was considered a form of carbon storage in long-lasting product. It just moved to permanent removal status one day, and that's it. A bit of lobbying, probably. But biochar is just a fancier name for charcoal, charcoal powder, actually. So it is much cheaper, obviously, to produce charcoal. It's a mature technology than to remove carbon from the atmosphere with DAGs or to capture bioenergy combustion. And that's the reason why biochar credits represent currently somewhere between 80 and 90% of the durable carbon credits on voluntary markets. But charcoal production has long been a source of deforestation. That's about 7% today globally, and forest degradation. That's actually the largest driver of forest degradation in some African countries today. There's a lot of interest in biochar in these countries, and worryingly. And it can be imported to the EU for the purpose of generating CRCF credits. It is cheaper to produce biochar in Latin America and Africa than Europe. It can be used in good ways. Its use in agriculture is ancient, but it comes with risks as well. And documenting the consequences of application would have been very useful for farming, but as Wayne said at the beginning, there is no MRV for biochar. We don't quite understand why. I mean, there was this argument made that it's technically not really feasible. I mean, for something so important, at the very least, you would want to document how things are going. You know, is this helping agriculture? Is it actually not helping agriculture? Is this feeding into land speculation for the purpose of generating carbon removal credits? We won't know. We won't know thanks to this. So if excessive logging is degrading the land sink in the Europe, maybe we can import the missing supply from elsewhere. The problem is that at the global level, the demand for wood is already excessive compared to the sustainable supply capacity. So that's not an option from the climate perspective. Last but not least, CRCF credits must be certified by voluntary certification schemes complying with recently adopted EU rules. But these certification rules are not sufficient either. I mean, this is not discussed really in the context of this delegated act, so I won't spend too much time on this, but you have to understand that these certification rules for the CRCF are essentially copied from the red certification rules, and there we know how they don't work for the simple fact that you just need to look at ongoing police investigations in a number of EU member states like Germany, France, Denmark, Netherlands. on fraudulent biofuels imports that have been certified, but the information generated by the certification schemes is not sufficient to enable scrutiny, and therefore that's why these member states had to call their police and customs officers, and this is why you have investigations now, because this certification system is not enabling sufficient scrutiny. This is not a new topic. Voluntary markets, carbon markets have been experiencing this kind of intractable, structural, systemic issues for more than 2 decades. By now, it's very well documented. And that is the reason why we need better rules. Excuse me, this is my, I'm done. This is why we need better rules that at the very least respect the CRCF regulation requirements. I didn't mention that, but Sophia in a second is going to explain you why that is not the case. And above all, please, that do ensure climate benefits, not mere symbolic reassurance, which is what we're discussing today. And by the way, the red rules for the post-2030 period are coming up for public consultation in the coming weeks, so pay attention. Thank you very much.
Sophia, over to you.
Okay, do you see my slides okay? Great. Thanks so much for the segue, Martin, and thanks everyone who's listening in. I would like to walk you through during this possibly less than 10 minutes presentation on why we call for a co-legislator as FERN, Carbon Market Watch, and WWF to reject the proposed CRCF. So as a way of introduction, what I would like to remind the audience today is that the Commission has quite some discretion to adopt delegated acts. And the only way that the co-legislator can reject it is whether they have certain legal elements to do so. And that is the purpose why I'm going to explain you where we see those issues. While the Commission has a lot of discretion, actually in the main treaty, in the TFU, there's very clearly written what are those limits. So the Commission does enjoy some discretion, but there's clearly some strict limits to that. And the most important one is that the delegated act cannot change essential elements of the law. And with this in mind, what we can think is what is the main essential elements of the CRCF? Like, how do we interpret the spirits of the CRCF? I mean, a lot of us in the call today and people that are in the audience as well have been part of the whole negotiations of the CRCF. But if we just look at the final act, what is now counts as the spirit of the law, we can simply look at the recitals to see what is the possible interpretation of the main objective of the CRCF. And here, just to give you an idea, it's to avoid greenwash. So this is the main part that what the Commission was aiming to do, and the co-legislator agreed that they will do with this act, to do not do any significant harm to the environment, and to eventually result in certifying activities that are net carbon removal benefit. Of course, here I'm referring specifically to the permanent removals, because the CRCF, as Juan had explained before, does certify also other type of activities, but for the purpose of today's conversation, we will focus on this objective. So now I would like to give you like a little bit of a headline list of where we see the Commission not respecting its mandate. I will not go into details in all of them, otherwise we will spend too much time, but just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we see the Commission failing in respecting the co-legislators' final agreement of the CRCF. So first of all, we see a failure to distinguish between removals and storage. That's found in Article 2. And it's the fact that simply when you read the Delegated Act, you see that actually the Commission is kind of mixing up the two concepts, and they are basically assuming that once you are storing the CO2, you're automatically producing a removal. That's just not the case, neither legally or scientifically speaking. Another very important article that we see a breach of is Article 4 for the failure to correctly account for all associated emissions. This was already presented by Martin as well in the previous presentation, and I will dive a little bit more into this in a second. We also see a breach of Article 6. Again, it was mentioned by Martin as well, the failure to implement MRV and liability requirements for biochar activities. Just to give you like a very easy example, The biochar activities, as was already said, are categorized as permanent removals. Permanent removals, according to the CRCF, needs to comply with the CCS directive regulations on liability and MRV. That simply doesn't happen. It's simple as that. It doesn't happen. So it's a very clear non-respect of the main legislative act. We also see, and maybe we can see those two together, a breach of Article 7 and Article 8 in respect to environmental integrity in general terms. So a failure to comply with the do not significant harm, and also with the requirement to protect restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. There, just to give you an example, since we're not sure which kind of activities will be certified and the land sector emissions are ignored, then what can result of this certification is also activities that are net emitter. And therefore, of course, you are doing significant harm to the main principle of climate mitigation. And likewise, if you are increasing the pressure of logging, you are therefore disregarding the principle of protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. So that's quite clear for us. So just to give you a little bit of a more detailed analysis and to really show you what is the text of the delegated act and what is the text of the legislation, I've decided to focus on Article 4. This was already also said by Martin, but just to really stress this element, because as also anticipated by Juan and in the introduction, the main point of the CRCF is really to have a quantitative assessment, not a qualitative one. So you understand that actually what we calculate as a net removal benefit is crucial. It's absolutely crucial. So here on this slide, you see what are the greenhouse gas associated emission that needs to be counted. And it's very clearly stated that all the direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions of the whole life cycle of the activity must be included. And there's even a specific mention that ILUC needs to be included there. And then in paragraph 7, I reported also very interesting, there is a super high level of leading scientific evidence that needs to be proven by the Commission. There's a whole list of objectives that the Commission needs to comply with. This is a really, really high level of threshold that was agreed by the co-legislator. So just to prove the point, what happens in the delegated act, the emissions are not all included in the calculation. Foregone sequestration is not there, ILUC is not there, reduction of carbon stocks in the forest is not there, emission produced by harvesting are not there. All of them are just disregarded. And as Martin has already explained, the reason why is that the Commission assumes that by linking to Article 29, the biomass sustainability criteria of the Renewable Energy Directive, they will be fulfilling their obligation. That's not the case, because Article 21 does not cover all the greenhouse gas emission. So the fact that the Commission is linking to the Renewable Energy Directive does not excuse them to comply with all the requirements of the CRCF. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It needs to be both. Elements need to be considered. And as already explained by Martin as well, the Article 29 is far from being a best available science. It's the result of a bad political compromise. So just to conclude my part of the presentation, I come back to my first slide to remind everyone what are really the strict limits that the Commission needs to operate within. So they cannot change essential elements of the law. And if we take up the view of what is the main point of the CRCF, why do we even want it? Why are we doing all this work for the past years? It's really to result in net carbon removal benefit. And if you don't account for all the emissions, how can the Commission get there? So with this, I will conclude and give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and see my presentation?
Felix, before we go through, sorry, I was still muted. I'm briefly going to go through a few conclusions, and then you can react to our conclusions and tell us if you think we're right or not, where you agree, where you disagree. It's important to do things that are science-based. Eco Institute is, of course, a very good, renowned research institute. When it comes to our conclusions, these permanent removal units, they really could impact climate policy across the board. That means that we have to have well-designed, watertight rules. We have to have trust in these things. As Sophia explained very well, the Delegate Act just does not respect the CRCF political compromise. It was a difficult compromise. There's a lot in there that nobody is happy with. That's the nature of a compromise. But the choices and the balance is really going towards maybe the less climate aware or or conservative groups. Their parts of the compromise are being very well respected. What others got in there, perhaps less. That also makes it legally very shaky. And Sophia, Martin, and myself, we are actually looking at potential legal challenges because this needs to be improved. Trust is very important. If you have a weak scheme, you have weak units. If you have weak units, that means that you get greenwashing concerns. And so our three organizations, we are calling for policymakers to reject this Delegated Act. We're very happy that in the Parliament, there are many groups considering this seriously. But if it does go through, which can always happen, of course, we would urge buyers to not use these CRCF units, to look for other better standards. And we've seen a few private sector standards that are slightly better, slightly stronger, and to focus on that. The CRCF was supposed to be a bit of a ceiling, a race to the top. The EU puts rules on the table that the rest of the world will follow, and we will all get to better standards in that process. But unfortunately, it's become a bit of a floor. If you're weaker than the CRCF, then your units are definitely not worth a lot. And so this race to the top we've lost, and therefore we think that it shouldn't be seen as an example for other schemes. Those are a bit our conclusions. Felix, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to react to some of the issues that you mentioned. Yeah, I think I do not want to make a statement on whether rejecting or not the CRCF. But I think the issues that you highlighted are important issues. And from our view, so we have at Öko-Institute been comparing a lot of carbon crediting methodologies and also carbon crediting approaches in the voluntary carbon market, in the CDM, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. And I think what is maybe important to understand is that there are some solutions available to close these gaps. Also, some of you mentioned, if you look at how other programs are doing that. So just to mention, I think from our view also these other programs have issues. They are not perfect, but the CRCF should align as much as possible with the best practices that we see in these other carbon crediting mechanisms. And that's why we did a comparison of the CRCF methodologies for permanent carbon removals with the methodology requirements of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, just to see how it compares. And I think this can help really to better understand also and put the shortcomings maybe in context also on what we see elsewhere. And we have made this comparison for the classic quality objectives for carbon credits, which include the additionality requirements, the requirements for quantification of the removals, for non-permanence, and also for safeguards and sustainable development. And then we compared where the CRCF aligns with the requirements that the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism sets out, and where, from our view, the risks for the unit integrity of CRCF units is high or low. And
Felix,
I don't have the time yet.
To interrupt you before you go into the comparison, you're not sharing your slides right now, and I think for the comparison that will become very interesting.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
No worries. It was very clear till now, but I know when you go into the comparison, then it's easy to have it in front of you.
It shows on my screen that I'm sharing, so I don't know what happens. Let me check again. Can you see it now?
Yeah, now we can see them.
Okay.
Thanks.
Apologies for that. Yeah, so so as I mentioned, we compared the CRCF with the requirements of the PACM. And I don't have the time to go in all of the comparison, but I just picked some to illustrate where some issues are and also how they could be maybe improved. And these are the the requirements for the investment analysis and the accounting for biomass use under both of these standards. So the investment analysis, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism and the CRCF diverge. So I think what is important to know, and it might be a bit nerdy, but I think it's important to understand, is that the CRCF uses a so-called standardized approach to demonstrate additionality, which means that not every project has to demonstrate additionality, but that the methodology developer, in this case the European Commission, sets the baseline and defines what type of activities are additional. And this is something that is standard in carbon crediting, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing if it's implemented properly and with safeguards. So, and I think here the PACM, if methodology developers for the PACM choose this standardized approach, they need to provide documented evidence and justification why they consider that incentives from the carbon crediting program are needed for the activity, and this must be included in the methodology so that it is clear why these incentives are needed. And the CRCF simply assumes that the activities under this methodology are not viable without the incentive from the CRCF, and the methodologies provide a small footnote on that, but do not really provide a detailed evidence and justification why this is the case for all of the removal technologies that are covered under this methodology. So in our view, this is maybe not so important for DAX and bio-CCS, but especially for biochar, this assumption might not be valid, because I think biochar has been produced worldwide without carbon credits for a long time. So in 2023, the International Biochar Initiative estimated that 50% of all the volume of biochar that has been produced without carbon credits revenues. And I think this number tells you, okay, yes, the credits can be an important assumption, an important incentive, but at the same time, also you really need to look into where and in which cases they are needed. And I think this analysis is important to ensure additionality of activities. And we've also seen that there are some other carbon crediting programs on the voluntary market who are certifying biochar removals, and some of them even require project-specific investment analysis for every project. So I think here the practice is different, and this also is applicable for projects in the EU, not only for projects in other countries. Then I think the second part that we wanted to highlight is the accounting for biomass use. I think we already saw in Martin's presentation that this is a really important issue. Yeah, here again, the rules diverge quite a bit between the PACM and the CRCF. So the main important issue is that the PACM requires full leakage accounting. That means that any emissions that are created by diverging biomass towards CRCF activities, so these emissions that need to be accounting. So any emissions not occurring on the project area, but due to the activity that is implemented by the CRCF is created in another part, that really needs to be accounted for under the PACM. And then further, the PACM has some safeguards. So it is prohibited to divert biomass from existing uses to an activity. So this is really a safeguard to prevent leakage, because if you divert biomass from an existing use, you might have to replace this biomass with another resource that also might have implications on emissions. And then it's very likely that the PACM will also prohibit the use of biomass from existing forest plantations. This is still under discussion because currently the PACM supervisory body is still developing the leakage tool for PACM activities. On the other side, the CRCF does not require leakage accounting at all. There are, however, some safeguards in the CRCF as well. So They exclude high-risk feedstocks and measures to curb demand, but we also have seen in Martin's presentation that this might not be sufficient. And the CRCF also allows using biomass that have existing use, and it allows using logs, roundwood, stumps, or roots, which is not allowed under the PACM, however, with restrictions for biochar. So in our view, the lack of these leakage provisions risks that the amount of biomass consumed may increase because of the CRCF activities. And if leakage is not appropriately accounted, that also may lead to an increase in EU emissions in the LULUCF effort sharing regulation or ETS sectors. Or if biomass is imported in the EU for CRCF activities, which is also allowed under the CRCF, that also might result in higher emissions in biomass exporting countries. So I think what is important to know in our view is that I think carbon markets already show characteristics of a so-called lemon market. That's a concept from economics, which says that if a market is very transparent, then always the lowest quality has an advantage in this market and might pursue in this market, which is very problematic. There has been a really serious global push in the latest few years to increase the integrity of carbon markets. This includes the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, the PACM, but also the Surface of Rating agencies that try to see how the integrity of certificate is. All of them also have problems, but I think what is important is that at least this kind of integrity needs to be met, and the CRCF should strive to meet this integrity to make sure that it is matching what is state of the art in carbon markets. And because the CRCF uses a standardized approach, in our view, many of the shortcomings could also be addressed without placing undue burden on project proponents. So like I mentioned in the investment analysis, the burden to prove that this is additional would be on the EU Commission by performing this analysis, for example, for biochar and not for project developers. And yeah, also overall observation, I think there's a tension in the CRCF that it tries to ensure that all the activities are in line with the EU regulations on several directives that you already have, which I think is a logical approach. But at the other hand, you also need to consider that the CRCF should be a standard setting instrument, and that might not be enough to just meet EU regulations, because like carbon market actors are used to have a standard that every project is following, and this is very important. And the final point, I think in 2026, there will be a review of the CRCF, and this really opens the door to make it more robust. There's a specific clause in that review to also compare it with the PACM and align it with the PACM. So yeah, we really would hope that this opportunity will be used to strengthen this instrument. And thank you. Yeah, I will give back to Weinand.
Thanks, Felix. I don't see you necessarily disagreeing strongly with us, but you did bring a few very interesting points on, yeah, is this a regulatory approach or is it a standard setting approach? On the one hand, it's not detailed enough to be a standard. On the other hand, it's perhaps also a bit too vague to be a regulatory approach. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. Thanks a lot for that. And even though we were going to try and stick away from the most technical aspects, I do still see we have got about 120 people who are still listening. So we managed to not push you away with going to the technicalities of the CRCF. There's a few questions that I think Sophia or Martin could take. If you can have a look at the Q&A, there's a few on use case that I'll start with, and then you guys can have a look at the ones on biochar, etc. So there's a question from Annika on the risks of offsetting. The risk of offsetting is very high. The Commission is looking into integrating permanent removals, CCS-based permanent removals, into the EU ETS. That means that DAX and BECS units that are certified through the scheme would be used to compensate for an emission. They would be made fully equal with an emission in the ETS. So there's already that offsetting risk where we will have fossil fuel emissions that are made equal to a removal unit on paper, but also beyond the ETS, there's a big risk. The only real use case existing, the only finance source that currently exists for anything coming from the CRCF is the voluntary carbon market. And the voluntary carbon market is largely dominated by actors seeking to offset their emissions. So whether this ends up in the ETS or not, these units will still be used for offsetting somewhere. And if it doesn't end up in the ETS, we're also, well, I'm personally a bit worried about potential double offsetting. For example, there's a bio-CCS plant being built in Stockholm by Stockholm Exergy. They have sold units to Microsoft in a deal. They are also getting subsidies from the Swedish state, and how that mechanism to ensure that the same removal units are not being used to offset two different types of emissions, those from Microsoft, which might be anywhere in the world, and emissions from another sector in the Swedish economy. There's no mechanism to counter that. I won't go into the details of Stockholm Exergy, how they're looking at this, but in general, the framework has no balancing mechanism for this. There's nothing to rule out that kind of double offsetting, which is, of course, a major concern for us. Then we also have another question on use case. Look for it from someone anonymous. How do you want to see the CRCF being used to drive climate action? What's our best hope for this? I can only give my best hope, and I'll give others the floor if they have another best hope. Our best hope is still that at some point we have a separate target. We have a separate framework. We have policies and targets for permanent removals that only look at these as an additional pillar of climate action. It's not instead of emission reductions, it's on top of emission reductions. That's now a bit more of a long-term hope, considering the 2040 target proposal didn't go in that direction, even though the ESA-BCC, the Environmental Scientific Advisory Board, the European Environmental, ESA-BCC, the Scientific Advisory Board, said, please do have separate targets. That didn't happen there. So in the long term, we're still hoping for this as a way. In the short term, there is something that the CRCF could do really well, that is build knowledge on these technologies, on how they work, how can you quantify, what are the gaps, what information is needed. And that would mean kind of a quicker review process with a lot more data being requested, especially in the biochar sector, to enable this learning by doing. And that's an opportunity that I feel is also being missed here. But that is an opportunity that could still be taken if this delegated act is kind of revisited. Before we go to you, Martin, there's one more question I'll take on biochar and soil organic carbon stocks from Cato. If you apply biochar to a soil, you will have impacts on your soil carbon, on your organic carbon in your soil. That could be either positive or negative. It depends on many different factors: temperature differences, density of your soil, climate, all those weather patterns. There's many factors. But this methodology on biochar does not look at that. It kind of ignores it. You can apply biochar to any soil and you don't really have to care on what is going to happen there. Is it going to have a negative impact on soil organic carbon? That is not subtracted. If it's having a positive impact, that's also not added. But another part of the CRCF, the carbon farming part, is also looking at that quantification of soil organic carbon and to incentivize the increase in soil organic carbon. And there's nothing in that methodology right now that says any soil where biochar is applied cannot also apply for soil organic carbon certificates. So there's also a risk of double counting there. If you would apply biochar and your soil organic carbon would increase, you could potentially get credits for both, which would not be acceptable from an environmental point of view. So that interplay between these two, between biochar and soil organic carbon, is kind of ignored. It's kind of left to the side. It's assumed that we'll solve it in the future. Well, I think it would have been better to kind of rule it out for now and enable that learning by doing I was talking about before. Martin, there's a few questions for you as well that you also might want to address the use cases and the hopes you have for the best use case.
Yeah, the hopes. I was going to start with that. Coming from the bioenergy perspective, again, honestly, my hope is whatever you do, don't make things worse, because that's what happened with the bioenergy. Yeah, you come up with this brilliant idea of deploying renewable energy, and what you're actually doing is accelerating the climate crisis. And that brings me to a very important point, in fact, on how to appreciate the accounting that we are looking at, because we're not in any moment. We don't have the luxury of having centuries to decide what's the best option. We are in a climate crisis. We must reduce emission and increase the land sink as much and as fast as possible. So waiting for decades or 1 or 2 centuries before you see a climate benefit is not an option, actually. So that is, I think, something that, in fact, the Delegated Act and these methodologies are crucially missing, is to properly look at the counterfactual scenario where, okay, where if you haven't logged that tree, what would have happened? So that's the first point. Yeah, there were a question. Yeah, there was a question on does a more convincing protocol than RED exist for identifying waste and residues? Well, I'm not used to saying that, but actually the market was better than RED subsidies. The wood panel industries used to essentially work out of sawdust and sawmill residues. They've been priced out of that by the wood pellets business, essentially. And there isn't really a single wood fiber that couldn't be used for either making a wood panel or even pulp and paper. Even the pulp and paper industry is protesting bioenergy subsidies as we speak, actually, for these reasons. So the problem of the RED definition of residues is that it's tautological. It is essentially letting the operator define what is and isn't a residue. But of course, deciding at the EU level what is and isn't a residue is difficult because of the multiplicity of reality. And so you have to look at how it is at the local level. How are your forests managed? What are the local wood industries? What are the possible alternative uses? There is one thing that's potentially useful in the RED 3, the latest one adopted in 23 on this, which is the cascading principle. It is, in fact, recognized in the CRCF Delegated Act, simply because it is complying with the RED on that. So in theory, operators and certification schemes looking at them must see that everybody is essentially complying with the law. But what will member states do on that, no one knows, because actually these elements have not been transposed in national legislation yet. So the famous residues argument is a really difficult one. My point would be that overall it is just much better not to incentivize the production of energy and carbon units out of residues. Because then you're creating a windfall effect, and everybody will just produce whatever residues are needed to generate that revenue. And there was another question, by the same person, Kato. It was mentioned that in the case of biochar, it is not guaranteed that the sequestered carbon will have come originally from the atmosphere. I don't remember saying that. Obviously, plants sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. Again, the question is, what is the counterfactual? So an observation that we can make here is related to the Stockholm Exergy by Beck's project, because it is a project at this rate. We calculated with the help of Swedish scientists that a mere 0.8 reduction of logging in Sweden would have removed from the atmosphere and for several times cheaper would have removed from the atmosphere the amount of carbon that these projects will remove from Swedish forests. At a considerably higher price. You mentioned Microsoft, and indeed it is the Swedish taxpayer who's going to pay for all this. There must be better uses for public money, even in the name of climate action, honestly. And I think that was all the questions for me for now.
Sophia, over to you. We've got less than 5 minutes. So Sophia, if you want to give some answers, Felix, if there are any questions you want to answer on, and then maybe we'll conclude.
Absolutely. I just have like one addition to what Martin has said. And I think in a way also responds to some of the questions a little bit more in general terms. I think one point that as WWF we thought through is okay, there are some difficulties in the quantifications, and it's true that ILUC is not an easy, it's not an easy factors to include in the quantification. We're totally aware of that. So what we have suggested the Commission, but they have not listened, is to do like an easier type of solution that would be for the exclusion of the worst feedstock. And for us, the exclusion of the worst feedstock should include dedicated crops, forest biomass, and any biomass that can be used by the local industry. So it's only fast decaying residues that are not used at the local level, basically. So that reduces the feedstock area to a very small pool. But in that way, we can make sure, without doing the very difficult calculations and creating a situation that is not also very positive for the industry, because they have to go through this calculation, we can simplify that and just make sure that we're using the correct type of feedstock. If we do that, we should be fine. So just to mention that, and maybe also to add that for the cascading use principle, of course, we're happy to see the recognition of the cascading use principle in the CRCF, but because it's linked to the RED, the scope is still quite limited, because to the best of my knowledge and is that the cascading use principle in the RED is only applicable for national subsidies and not overall all the time. So its scope is still quite limited. It doesn't really solve the issue. So I will conclude here in case Felix wants to say something.
Yeah, maybe just on the one question whether private standards are better than the CRCF. I think we haven't compared systematically the private standards with the CRCF, so we cannot really make a statement that they are better or worse, or which one is better. I think there are elements where they are better. So, for example, on what I mentioned on the investment analysis, there are standards like Pure Earth who require this investment analysis on a project by project level, which might be more robust than the standardized approach. But I think we cannot derive from that generally private standards are better than the CRCF. And to me, it will be also interesting to see, because the EU will allow these standards to get recognition under the CRCF, what type of rules these standards will actually use to certify units under the CRCF. So this will be, I think, also interesting to follow.
Okay, then we are one to the hour, so I'll wrap up a bit. There were a few questions that maybe I'll give a quick answer to that nobody picked up. On what Sophia was mentioning on limit risks, there was another thing that we suggested to the Commission, which was ban the use of imported biomass. That at least if there are problems on direct or indirect land use change, they're in Europe. We're not exporting deforestation, because the deforestation regulation has also taken a few hits and might take a few more in the near term. That is an important aspect of just, well, let's just make sure we're not doing worse abroad than we're doing at home, because we cannot monitor these things the same way abroad as we can in the EU. It is always more complicated in third countries. For example, a lot of our biomass right now comes from the United States, and they are no longer a party to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So is any biomass we import from there is kind of disappearing from the rule book. And that, I think, is something that the Commission really should have taken more seriously. On direct air capture and the CCS directive, on the CCS directive, it is being used for the bio-CCS and direct air capture. I'm not an expert on the CCS directive, but the people who are tell me that it's pretty okay. It's got liability rules, it's got monitoring rules. Risks and liability are in the hands of the operators till governments agree to take them over. So there's a strong incentive to do it correctly in that scheme. But of course, it remains a risky approach, because you will be storing CO2 potentially for millennia, and you do need to maintain that monitoring over that time. That's always difficult. On DAX, I personally think it's the best of the three. So I think that part of the methodology is better than bio-CCS and biochar, especially biochar I find the most problematic of the three. But even then, the DAX one is not perfect. It kind of ignores renewable energy, the need for additional renewable energy. The current methodology would allow for the cannibalization of the energy transition in other sectors for direct air capture. It doesn't ask for additional renewable energy. It actually grandfathers the rules so that till 2045, you can keep on using annual matching. So if there's a windy, hot summer, you can pretend in the winter that you're still using the same renewable energy that was created in the summer, even though it has not been stored anywhere. So on paper, you could be using renewable energy, but in real world, you might be very much using fossil. Those are the last questions that I thought I could quickly answer. Thank you everybody for joining us. On the Carmark Watch LinkedIn page a bit later today, you'll see a recording, you'll also see slides, you'll see some basic quotes from us. Why we did this webinar is first and for all because we do feel that this is a delegated act that needs to be objected to. It is supposed to quantify, certify permanent removals that are trustworthy, that we know have a positive environmental and climate impact, and that is trust that we simply do not have. There are too many loopholes, and that's why we're calling for the objection to these rules. Because if we do not object, then these rules will fail. They will fail the climate, they will fail the environment, they will be on paper, we will be making progress, while in the real world, in the real atmosphere, we will not be making progress. And we cannot waste time on fake solutions or on distractions. And right now, bio-CCS, biochar, but also direct air capture to some extent, will be very problematic if they're certified this way. It needs to be done better, risks need to be minimized, and there are concrete ways to do that. And we have all been feeding that into the Commission for the last 3 years. So that's why we think these rules will fail. We've highlighted many problems. My colleague Marlene has also put another publication that we made that goes into other problems that have been highlighted. So we haven't had the time to discuss everything that's wrong with this methodology. There's too much, but we have, I hope, given a good oversight on what the main ones are and the damage that they could do. So then I'll hereby say thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Felix, Martin, Sophia, for speaking, especially Felix for taking, it's not easy to react to 3 NGOs, but happy that you seem to agree with us on most things. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, and send us an email if you have a question that we haven't answered. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.